way the rounds work is we introduce ourselves, or we don't even have to introduce ourselves. We can say some of the surnames, and since we're genealogical, and you'll find out the men's and the ladies. That's the most important thing to take care of. Now, may I ask you?
That's okay.
Brittingham, is that your?
Brittingham.
Sharon Brittingham from Montrose, Montana. Where are you from?
Well, actually, I'm living right now in Park Summit. I'm actually from New York State. My husband's family is from Hot Bottom and Lakeside. But it's the McClough family. I'm talking about McClough.
And what we're going to learn from you tonight is what?
Actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I just want to say, Nancy had heard me talking when I did diversity workshops and multicultural workshops, because I'm the director of the Multicultural Affairs Office at Keystone College. So I do a lot of different programs, and she had heard me talk a little bit about my family and how diverse my family is. And when I found out what you all do, number one, I want to say that it really encouraged me to start looking again. It's very difficult to find when you have Native American in your family and African American because of slavery. But I also have English, Irish, French. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and talk about some, just maybe have a little bit of discussion on even things that you might think would be helpful in doing some of those searches, since some of you have been doing it for a lot longer.
All right, very good. Thank you.
Almost up.
Thank you. It hasn't worked.
So I'll just
You are informal, and Sharon's in charge. Thank you, Sharon.
Okay. I'm glad to be here. If you don't mind, I think I'd like to just sit so we can all kind of be at the same level here and comfortable. Again, let me just, Nancy Locke volunteers, does tutoring at school, does other things, and she came to me after hearing me do another presentation, and I had mentioned things about my family, and she came and said, well, we have speakers and we'd love to have you come and speak. And I really didn't know much about the society at that point. But as I always do, I like to do background and research, and so I learned more and more. And as I said a few minutes ago, it encouraged me to talk to people more about our families, to look up more. And periodically over the years, I have been interested in looking up my family history, and there's always been some brick wall. Does that sound familiar? Yes. So I'll go back to talking a little bit about my family, and then I will come forward and talk a little bit about my husband's family, the McClough family, and because they are from Pennsylvania, and it's a very, very large. In fact, at one point they were told they were one of the largest families, not only the largest black families, but one of the largest families in all of Northeast Pennsylvania. So it's very interesting to me. I was born in Rochester, New York. What makes my search about family history so difficult, though, is that my mother is white, and my mother was raised, my grandfather and grandmother are English and Irish, Thomas Patrick Malloy, and my grandmother's last name is Helen Sauer, S-A-U-E-R. Well, that would be really difficult enough, except that my mother was adopted. And so if you know about adoption records, especially adoption records 70 years ago, 80 years ago, you could not, it's only been, I think, maybe, 10 years maybe, that it's gotten easier and easier, and they're allowing people to have information about their adoptive families. Well, my mom has made a search at different times, and she was able to find out that, which is kind of funny, because being of a mixed race, my dad is African American and Native American, and the interesting thing that she found out was that her real mother's last name is Stowe, S-T-O-W-E, and there's a really strong indication from the work that she had done, and that I'm now trying to follow up on, that she was related to, or is related to, Harriet Beecher Stowe. which I don't know if many of you know, but Harry Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, about black people in the South, and et cetera. So it's very interesting that my mother, coming from an English, Stowe was English, an English background and being white, happened to marry my father, who was black and Native American, and then find out that her true relatives were probably, one of the women was probably Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote about slavery. So I thought that in itself was very fascinating. It's one of those gems that you come across. So I'm right now, again, because of this, because of you all, and Nancy Locke, I'm actually wanting to confirm whether this is really true. And while my mother is still living, because I really would love to give her that gift of really being able to say, this is my family. And so I want to do that for my mom. And then the really, really difficult part, as if that wasn't difficult enough with closed adoption records and those kind of things, the really difficult part for me is that with my father being African American and Native American, number one, Native Americans in this country were divided up kind of randomly. It's actually, if it's, for instance, if we're all in this room and somebody decided that wanted to divide us up into 10 nations, and they kind of took a map of the room, and you're sitting wherever you're sitting for whatever reason. You might always sit there, or you might sometimes sit there, but for this particular night, if this was a particular night that you were going to be divided, the map would lay down, and then somebody would come along and they would say, okay, from here to here is going to be the Cherokee Nation, from here to here is going to be this nation, from here to here is going to be this nation. Well, you could be visiting your cousin and really live over here, but from that point on, you are part of this particular tribe. So a lot of Native Americans were actually forced to live with and be a community with people that they may not even speak the same language with. You know, and we see now even some of the difficulties that people have getting along in terms of, you know, this immigrant crisis, and I say it's a crisis because it's a crisis for everyone. It's a crisis for those who believe that immigrants shouldn't come in. It's a crisis for those who believe that immigrants should come in. Either way, it's a crisis, and it's very similar to what happened with Native Americans because they were forced to live with people that they may not have things in common with. So if there was a line here, but they drew the line over here, everybody that lived here, whether they spoke the same language or had the same culture, had to live together, and from that point on, be called a particular tribe or nation. So the difficulty is that there's not a lot of written records about Native Americans, and tribal names are not really dependable, again, because there could have been several different groups within what's called the Cherokee tribal nation. So that's a stone wall. So if you can't get information from your relatives, you're done. My dad was an only child, and my mom was an only child who was adopted. So, you know, if you look at how, you know, you might have lived in the same house, and you know who your grandparents are, and they know who their grandparents were, and they know what country. Well, for people of mixed racial heritage, it gets very, very frustrating. And then, so we have the adoption piece, which makes it difficult. Then we have the Native American piece, which makes it difficult. And then, let's add on African American. Well, African Americans were brought over. They're the only group of people in the United States that did not immigrate on their own, of their own volition. It wasn't their own decision, so they said, you know, we want to go over to America. They were brought here against their will, and they're the only ones that are really, truly not immigrants, because there's not really any name really to give, because they were brought here against their will. And the way that it was done was done by very many nations. So it could have been by French, by English, by Chinese even, and different people who worked with them to bring slaves over. When slaves were brought over, their tribal names were completely lost. Their tribal names were completely lost, so then their tribes were completely lost. So again, for me, it's, I don't know, it seems like, what is that, a needle in a haystack? However, I still believe that there's always a connection that can be made that you just never know. And I like, Joe, what you were saying earlier, when you go around and say the surnames, because just that one day you might say a surname, like me saying Stowe now, and you might be searching and say, oh, I remember when she said Stowe. Look at that, there's like all this information about Stowe. Well, then move up to the present time, and I married my husband, Timmy McClough, in 1991. And even though we're no longer together as a married couple, we are very good friends, and I've stayed very close to the family. Well, what I didn't know, did somebody say that Sherman Wooden from the Anti-Slavery Institute has been to speak? Yes. Well, Sherman and I had worked together through the universities, and Keystone College does a lot of, they support the Center for Anti-Slavery Institute, so there's a lot of genealogical work being done by that institute in order to show information about the Underground Railroad. And as that was happening, I'll tell you a really funny story, and maybe you kind of run into the same thing. I work with somebody at Keystone, and I said, she's from Nicholson. And I said, oh, my husband's from Nicholson. And she said, no, you must be mistaken. I said, no, I'm pretty sure, that my husband was from Nicholson, and my husband and his brothers went to Hot Bottom School. No, she says, I've lived there for over 30 years, and there were no black people in Nicholson and Hot Bottom. And I'm beginning to question my own self, thinking, maybe I'm wrong. So I went back to my sister-in-law, and I said, was I wrong? Because this person's from there. She says, no, because his grandparents lived there, his parents lived in that area, and he grew up as a boy. He says, I have pictures, so I want to get pictures. I mean, that's a really great thing, because you can't, if you have a school and you have them standing out front of the school, you can't dispute that at one point, at least they were standing out in front of the school. Whether they went there or not, you have to have records. So one of the things I thought about, that perhaps my being here, it's already helped me. It's already helped me just being asked to speak, because it made me do some work. It made me think about a lot of things that I hadn't thought about in a long time. And what I wanted to share with you all is how complex, and I'm sure you've begun to find it out, how connected we really are without knowing it. And I was at a dinner the other night, for the United Nations Association, and I met David Wenzel. And David Wenzel, I guess, was a mayor in the 80s, right? So I said to David Wenzel, I said, hi, and I said, I'm at Keystone, and I'm getting, acclimated and getting to know people more in the Scranton area, because I had been in the Wilkes-Barre area. And I said, and my ex-husband is from this area. And so he said, well, what's his name? And I said, McClough. And he goes, we're in-laws. So I just found out that Dave Wenzel and I are related through our in-laws, because his niece is married to my nephew. So there you go. You just never, isn't that amazing?
And his wife is my cousin.
And his there you go. Now his wife is Janet, right? And she's your cousin. Isn't that amazing? Now see how wonderful it really is to do the kind of work that you're doing, because number one, I think that it's really important for us to be connected to our families. I think it's important for us to be connected to our communities. and connected to each other. And I truly believe, and I guess I'm kind of idealistic, I'm more of a, what's her name? You know, that when I was younger, they always said, I'll think of it, but I'm really, you know, silver lining kind of person, and I really truly believe that the more we really know about each other, and the more that we communicate to each other and learn about each other, the less likely that we'll be doing some of the things that we're doing now, killing each other. I mean, to me, that's one of the saddest things that's happening in our world today, is that people are polarized, and, you know, it's them against us, and people are killing people, and it's just very sad, because really, the more you dig, and you're talking about digging a little deeper, I just found out that and I mentioned that when I was looking up the surnames, my grandmother's last name is Laws, L-A-W-S. And I did not know that that could either be French, but there's also Laws that's spelled L-E-W-E-S, and that was Scottish. And then with sour, that could either be English. It's mostly English, but there are other ways. So it's interesting, because as a child, I was always connected to the French, everything French. French food, I taught myself French. I felt like I had lived in France, in the countryside. I could describe the countryside before I even really knew a lot about it. We'll come to find out that one of, you know, the surname could be more connected to the French community than it actually is to the Scottish community. So it's very, very fascinating. And I, again, want to just share these pieces with you, because as you go along, perhaps you can be aware when, you know, by accident, you might pop up and see an African-American family. But that African-American family, like Joe and I now, we can say we're connected through this connection and through that connection, could very well be connected, and also could very well give somebody else the kind of joy that you get when you say, aha, you know, you've traced that path and found a real person and real information about that person. So I want to encourage you, if you hear information about Stowe, definitely, because that's more around my mom, and I really would love to be able to give her the gift of knowing about who really was her family, you know. And I still am looking at the family that raised her just to know more about them, and that was Malloy and Sauer, which was my grandmother's last name. And then in my family, we have Laws, L-A-W-S, and Brittingham, which again, one of the things I'm not sure that you know about, but in slavery days, oftentimes a lot of black families have English names, because in slavery days, they were given the name of the plantation owner. Once they were slaves and they were in this particular household, they were actually given the name of the slavery owner. And that's why back in, I guess, the late 60s and early 70s, when there was a revolution and a lot of black people started taking African names, that's one of the reasons why, because, and they just kind of picked African names. Now, what I found out through DNA, and you all are going to be talking about that soon as well, I saw, but through DNA now, they can actually trace which African group. Yeah. So this is the first time in history that many, many African-American families will be able to have a connection, at least to a country. You know, maybe not a specific, but isn't that amazing? Because
they did that on Good Morning America.
Did they?
Yeah. Yeah, they did the DNA, and that one reporter, can't remember his name now, but he traces his ancestors back, and he found out that he was the tribe, and he went over and he saw his relatives and everything.
Yeah, and that's really exciting, because if you think about it, just think about how frustrating that would be to not even know what country your ancestors came. You knew they came from, now, if somebody said to you, oh, your ancestors came from Europe, well, there's a lot of diverse groups within what's called Europe. It could be French, English, German, so it's the same thing with Africa, because Africa has so many different parts, and they're so very different from each other. It makes a big difference if you come from Ghana as opposed to coming from South Africa like the Sutu. It's a totally different culture, it's a totally different place. So this is, for genealogical research, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. It's for the very first time. And also for the very first time, people will be able to at least begin tracing what groups of Native Americans they also came from, specifically. Because again, if you were lived in Virginia, we just kind of guess. We say, okay, what groups were there? But we really didn't know. Why is that going to be so important for you in this room, in this particular community? Because our communities are changing. Whether we like it or not, whether it's comfortable for us or not, it's a reality. And in Northeast Pennsylvania, I need to tell you, besides the Hispanic and Latino community, which I'm very much mistaken for, so with all of this, I have to tell you, with all of this going on about immigrants and not immigrants, terrorists and not terrorists, this is also the first time in my life, having been mixed and being the color that I am, and people not really being able to tell what nationality, and with my boys, we get targeted a lot. My sons get targeted a lot because they either look like an immigrant or like a terrorist. And so you go into an airport, you don't think about that too much until somebody says, well, wait a minute, I have to check all your stuff, as somebody else just keeps going through the line. You think, well, what did I do? I'm a pretty decent person, I didn't do anything. And you have to worry for your children. My oldest son, take a little breath. My oldest son, his father is Afro-Cuban and Chinese.
Wow.
So let's just mix it right up into the pot. And so there you go. So I have one son, and his father is Afro-Cuban and Chinese, and my other two sons, their fathers are Native American and African American. Makes it a little more simple. But do you see where I'm going with this? So in what the world is doing is separating and everybody taking their own little spot, it kind of leaves a whole group of people, and a growing group of people, with no spot to take. And one of the things I think that Nancy heard me say is, when I was in Rochester and they had the riots in Rochester, the racial riots, well, I was brought up by my mom, who's white, in a black and Italian neighborhood. And so, and I felt, and most of the families that were in the black community were from the South. So it was a Southern black community in New York State. And the Italian families were recently, immigrated from Italy and spoke Italian and cooked Italian. And my mom was always the type of person who would learn to cook. So I grew up on Italian food and Southern food. And we all kind of had, got along, whatever. But again, when they had the riots, I remember saying to my mother, what will happen? Because here I am, and there was 4 of us, mixed children, considered black children, with my mother, who's white, in a house where outside people are rioting. I mean, and they had National Guards marching up and down the street. It was 1974. And they have a whole documentary on it because it was one of the major places that they had rioted. And it was terrifying. I have sleep disorder to this day because of the trauma of being in a house where people are taking sides against being black and white, but my mother's white and we're black. And I remember saying, you know, what's going to happen if once, you know, if black people are on this side of the street and white people are on this, where does that leave us but in the middle to get kind of trampled by everybody? And so I'm really glad to have this opportunity. Some of this is very serious and some of it's very deep and complex. But the whole thing is that we have an opportunity, and you all really have a wonderful opportunity to make a difference in the research that you begin to do and you begin to spread. And I was telling Joe, I'm going to do everything in my power to find out how you all can get grants. That's one of my second missions, because you all really should. You know, you've been doing this for 11 years, and you're doing wonderful work, and you're compiling people's life stories and their history, and you're connecting people. And I just think it's great, and so I would like to somehow stay connected and come back and see you again. Does anybody have any questions?
I was just listening to public radio yesterday, which is something that I have to find a station, you know. But they were talking about Henry, I think his name was Beecher, and he was the most famous man in America in the 1860s. And he was Harriet Beecher's brother.
Okay.
And so there must be a lot of information on him, which should lead you to
You know what, I didn't even think about looking under features, so that's really
But
good.
he was very famous, and Lincoln had him go somewhere and rededicate Fort Sumter. I don't know why they were talking about that. And then right after that, he came back north, but he was a very charismatic preacher.
And isn't that interesting? I mean, because again, I think it's just interesting the fact that our family is biracial, and then tracing roots back to some, you know, another family that was involved in a lot of the Civil War and anti-slavery things. The other part that I was going to mention when I said, what does it make a difference to you all? Because, again, whether it's something you agree with or like or don't like, it's a fact that in northeastern Pennsylvania, there is a tremendous amount of mixed families. Black and white, Latino and black, Latino, black and white. And Wilkes-Barre, again, Scranton, I think that, you know, it's pretty obvious. And in my family, my husband's family alone is, you know, there is a lot of now interracial marriages. And so what that means is that we actually are becoming family. And so there will be more and more ties now when you click back and click over to who your relatives are. So it's not a simple thing, but it's kind of a fun and wonderful thing, and it's really nice to be connected. So thank you again for inviting me here. And I don't know if anybody else had any more questions? Yes.
No.
I tried back in the early 80s when I came out of the country. I wrote St. Anne's
There's no
Orphanage,
saying.
Chicago. I was standing in this building, they got the representative, and I could never get an answer. Got any ideas how I can go back to the 1920s, get them to give me some information?
I know that there's a
And
lot.
got any ideas when these orphanages did exist?
Right.
And they still have the records, they haven't burnt down. If you got any ideas on how to go with
They
that?
run by a church.
It's my mother, yeah.
Maybe you
See,
could get in through the church
No,
that's sponsored them.
we come from a Protestant family, and I found out the only way you could get a kid out of St. Louis Orphanage in Chicago is if you were Catholic. Because a Catholic orphanage in the 1920s didn't give a kid to but you know, the problem is, even if I flew out there, I mean, how would I get to the door? How do you deal?
Well, I think now with the computer, you could at least make some initial contacts that could maybe lead to other contacts so that you wouldn't have to be running all over the country. That's the wonderful thing about the computer. And we did very generically by talking about, asking about
But you
adoption.
spoke of closed records.
Yeah.
How can we get these orphanages? And I understand most of them were run by a church, right? In the 1900s
Or the state.
Or the state, yeah. I was gonna say.
Some of the state. My sister's father-in-law was raised in a state orphanage.
I think they're now beginning to open the records more and more because there are more and more children and adults who want to know, and that they, I believe, legally have a right to know at this point.
I think to the secrets of the 20s are probably, they figure everybody that was involved, the adults, are less likely to protest.
Well, thank you again for having me here. Anybody else?
I'd like to make a comment on what she said. We had a man from Iowa or Idaho come to our society specifically because somebody told him that we could help him find his ancestors. And we did. So while he was there, and he was so impressed with the way he helped us find something, while he was there, a lady came in who was in her 70s. And she remembered that her Aunt Veronica left home when she was this lady was a little girl. And she knows nothing about Aunt Veronica, and she went to find out about Aunt Veronica. Now this you say about closed records and how difficult this must be. And I guess I'm bragging now, but the wisdom of the way we set up this society is we try to capitalize on everybody's, use your users, we say. Somebody's good at something, we try to get them to use that thing. Well, we have one lady who's very knowledgeable with computers and the web and all this other stuff. And she put together an algorithm where she searches, she works all night, so she does this, her computer works all night while she's doing it, she's a nurse. And she comes home in the morning, she has all these hits of where some obit in some newspaper somewhere in America states that this person was born in Oliphant or Dixon or Sturgis or Danville or all these other towns that she has in there. And she sends them to me, and then we load them into our computer. She sends them as a PDF file. Nonetheless, we have almost 3,000 this year of people who were born here but died someplace else. Well, anyhow, so I went to this computer that we stored this information on for this lady looking for Aunt Veronica. And all she knew was Aunt Veronica's maiden name, and she lived in Jessup. Well, we punched in the name, and sure enough, Veronica's mother and father's name popped up. And told us who Veronica married in Connecticut, how many children she had, when she died, where she's buried, and brothers and sisters, who predeceased her, who survived. So she had her whole family tree in 6 minutes.
Wow.
She was astounded that anybody could do something like that.
I know.
And the only reason it happened was because this girl in Connecticut worked out this algorithm and put all this stuff together, and we loaded it to our computer. So we've done the same thing. We get paid by some of these organizations that do the sheets, which they're looking for descendants rather than looking for ancestors. And quite often we wind up at St. Joseph's Hospital in Scranton, and they're reticent to give us any information, but they're surprised at the information we already have, and it's that they're not telling us something we don't already know, they're confirming something that we already know. They won't give us a document stating that, but it gives us enough information to take care of it. And the outfits that we do this work for, most of them are out in Salt Lake City, because Salt Lake City has all these, genealogical records. And so then they hide, because some of these estates are considerable, and I guess they get a large percentage of this estate for finding the heirs. So they have some really high-priced lawyers, I guess, and I've seen where they've sent a letter from some lawyer out in Salt Lake City, and the St. Joe's released information to them that they wouldn't give to anybody else. And I'm sure the same thing, and I guess the bottom line is with all this, if there's money involved, somebody's gonna open up the books. You know what I mean? How or what or where, or threat of something. But if you're just patient enough, as she says, things will work out. You can't just go right to one spot. And serendipity plays the biggest role in genealogy of any one thing going. Just as she said about Mayor Wenzel, who would think that she and I are sharing a link somehow, you know? So you don't know. So just keep hustling for it, I guess, is the only thing I can say. Does anyone else have anything they want to say or state?
Just a comment, just to
Yes,
refresh,
please.
just to bring back, well, 2 years ago, we were over on Grand Street, I remember a young fellow that was adopted. The same way, I think the society helped him get connected with his mother. And I don't want to mention, I don't know his personal name. Long story short, I remember the kid when he was a little kid, growing up in my neighborhood.
Oh, yeah.
I never even knew.
Yeah.
But he knew, and I think through some different connections, he ended up.
We found his mother for him.
Right, and I think, you know, for health reasons alone, he was looking for some history, health history. Certainly his mother would probably know what she suffered from, or maybe his father, or whatever. I know the society helped that young man.
I remember you guys had. Anyhow, some of those things are really remarkable, and you don't always go straight, you know, like shooting a rifle. You don't always go right to the point that you're looking for. Sometimes it's just scattered here and there, and then another, just a little tale I like to say. I don't want to take your time on it. But the same lady in Connecticut that sends us these algorithms, that does this algorithm and sends us these little bits every morning, somebody will give us a call or ask us to do a search, and I'll go through our database and we don't have that name. Never heard of that name. It's Brittingham. We have no Brittinghams in our database. Can't find one. But she'll say, well, let me send you the information and see if you can find something for me. So she either emails or sends the stuff. And this is where I get goosebumps, and this is where serendipity plays its role. So I have Brittingham in my mind because we didn't have any Brittinghams. Not the next morning, but somehow the next 3 or 4 days, as I'm reading the emails from this girl, out pops up Brittingham. Now, how could this possibly be? I mean, for 11 years, we didn't have one Brittingham. The lady Brittingham asked us to look for Brittingham, and that week a Brittingham shows up. I mean, I think that's hokey enough to scare you. Now, whether it's related to her Brittinghams or not is another case, but the point is that they appear. How they appear. So if you're persistent enough, they'll appear.
Well, it reminds me of a story that I saw in a documentary, and there was a young couple that had gotten engaged, and somehow her ring, when they were on their honeymoon, had slipped down and been lost on this old ship. Years later, they were like, it was like in ruins, and people were going through like this, like pulling up boards and just kind of trashing things, and somebody saw this shiny thing, and it was the ring, and they were able, I think it was like 40 years later, they were actually able to look at the ship's log, figure out about when they thought it would be, and they actually tracked them down. So if they can do that with a lost ring in the bottom of a ship, then we can find out. And I really believe that the more you do, what you're doing here too, is the more that you dig and unearth, the more that people all over the country and all over the United States are going to be able to tap in because you're unearthing it. So I applaud what you do, and I really feel honored.
We have a small presentation we'd like to offer to you, and our publicity director.
Get off the couch. We want to thank you for coming. We enjoyed everything you had to say. And this is from, now you got to get your picture. See?
Okay.
Joe always has a big smile.
Thank you very much.
And I'm tracing someone called Sunflower Yarn. This is not funny. This is serious. Tracing someone called Sunflower Yarns, who was a black man from Arkansas who somehow connected with my Yarns family and went to Minnesota. And I don't know how you find out what his real name was. I'm assuming he took
This
yarn.
is exciting.
Yes.
I will keep my
Yes,
Keep my
yeah,
eye.
the first time I looked at it, I thought, oh my, yes, yeah. It's over there. Did you get it?
Yes, I got you.
Oh, he always gets you good stuff, don't worry.
Okay, now we have our 50/50 drawing. I don't know if anybody else wants to buy another ticket, but we have a